The screen door was banging in the wind, that hollow metallic sound that cuts through summer air and makes mothers look up from whatever they're doing, some instinct telling them something's wrong. It was August 19th, 1961, a Saturday afternoon so hot the asphalt on Maple Street had gone soft and sticky, and Barbara Hughes was in her kitchen washing lunch dishes when she heard it, that bang, bang, bang of the door hitting the frame over and over. She told Hannah 3 times that morning to stop letting it slam, but 6-year-olds don't remember things like that when there are fireflies to catch and hopscotch squares to draw, and the whole endless summer stretched out like a promise. Barbara dried her hands on her apron, turned toward the living room, and that's when she realized the sound she wasn't hearing was worse than the sound she was. No voices, no laughter, no squeaky wheels from Hannah's red bicycle going round and round the driveway. Just that door, banging and banging, and a silence underneath it that made her heart drop before her mind even understood why. Before we continue this story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light. Barbara ran to the front door and out onto the porch, her wet hands leaving prints on the door frame, and what she saw made her stomach clench with a fear that every mother knows but prays never to feel. Hannah's bicycle was lying on its side in the driveway, the front wheel still spinning slowly in the afternoon sun, going round and round and round like it had just been dropped. Hannah's younger brother Tommy, barely 4 years old, was sitting on the front step playing with his toy truck, completely oblivious. The street was empty, that dead quiet you get in small Indiana towns on August afternoons when it's too hot to move and everyone's inside with their fans on and their curtains drawn. Barbara's voice came out wrong, too high and tight when she called Hannah's name, then louder. Then she was running down the driveway in her house slippers, looking left and right, her voice climbing into something close to a scream as she ran into the middle of Maple Street calling for her daughter. Hannah Marie Hughes had been outside for maybe 20 minutes, half an hour at most. Barbara had seen her through the kitchen window not long ago, pedaling her bicycle in circles, her white blonde pigtails flying behind her, wearing the yellow sundress with the daisies that she'd begged to wear, even though it was really for church. Hannah was the kind of child people noticed, all energy and light, with a gap-toothed smile that made strangers smile back and a voice that carried 3 houses down when she was excited about something. She'd lost her 2 front teeth that summer and was impossibly proud of it, kept sticking her tongue through the gap and making her siblings laugh. She was obsessed with catching fireflies in mason jars, could spend hours trying to sneak up on them in the grass at dusk, and she had a collection of smooth stones she'd gathered from the creek behind their house that she'd arranged by color on her windowsill. She was 6 years old, just 6, about to start first grade in 2 weeks, and she was the kind of child who made you believe the world was essentially good, because how could anything bad happen in a world that contained a kid like Hannah Hughes? Barbara ran back to the house and grabbed Tommy, shook him maybe harder than she meant to, asked him where Hannah went. "Where's your sister? What happened?" Tommy just looked at her with those big, confused eyes and said he didn't know. Hannah was riding her bike, and then she wasn't. Maybe she went inside. But Hannah wasn't inside. Barbara tore through the house calling her name, checked every room, every closet, under beds in the basement, places that made no sense, but panic doesn't follow logic. She ran to the backyard, checked the shed, the old garage where her husband Ray kept his tools. Nothing. She ran to the neighbors on both sides, pounded on doors, asked if they'd seen Hannah, if she'd come over to play. No one had seen her. No one had heard anything. It had been a quiet Saturday afternoon, and then suddenly it wasn't. And within 10 minutes, half of Maple Street was out on their lawns and driveways, calling Hannah's name, looking behind bushes and in garages and under porches, that collective dread spreading like something physical you could feel. In the air. Ray Hughes was at work at the Skyline Corporation factory on the east side of Elkhart, one of the big RV manufacturers that employed half the men in town, working overtime on a Saturday because they had a big order to fill, and the money was good. When his supervisor pulled him off the line and told him there was an emergency phone call, Ray knew before he picked up the receiver that his life was about to change in a way it could never change back. You just know. Barbara was hysterical on the other end, barely coherent, and Ray heard the words that would echo in his nightmares for the rest of his life. "Hannah's gone. We can't find her. She was just here and now she's gone." Ray doesn't remember the drive home, doesn't remember getting in his truck or the 7 miles between the factory and Maple Street, just remembers pulling up to a scene that looked like something from a movie, police cars already there with lights flashing, neighbors everywhere, search parties forming. and his wife sitting on the front steps with her face in her hands while their other children stood around her looking scared and confused. The Elkhart Police Department responded within minutes of Barbara's call, and by 3 p.m., less than an hour after Hannah disappeared, they had officers going door to door on every street within a 6-block radius. Chief Harold Brennan, a man who'd been in law enforcement for 23 years and had never worked a child abduction, set up a command post in the Hughes' living room and tried to get a coherent timeline from Barbara while his officers searched the neighborhood. When did you last see her? What was she wearing? Did you notice any unusual cars or people in the area? Were there any recent arguments or problems at home? The questions felt invasive and necessary all at once, and Barbara answered them through tears, while Ray sat beside her holding her hand so tight his knuckles went white. Hannah had been outside playing at approximately 1003 p.m. She was wearing a yellow sundress, white sandals, and her hair was in pigtails with blue ribbons. She had no reason to run away. She was a happy child. There had been no strangers in the neighborhood that Barbara had noticed, no strange cars, no one who didn't belong. But as police interviewed neighbors, a pattern emerged that made Chief Brennan's jaw tighten. Several people mentioned seeing a man earlier that day, maybe late morning, walking up and down Maple Street like he was looking for an address. One neighbor described him as maybe 35 or 40, wearing work clothes, driving a dark-colored sedan that might have been a Chevrolet or a Ford. Nobody was sure. Another neighbor thought she'd seen the same car parked 2 streets over around noon, the man sitting inside like he was waiting for something. The descriptions were vague and contradictory, the way eyewitness accounts always are, but it was enough to make Brennan call in the Indiana State Police and request FBI assistance. By evening, FBI agents from the Indianapolis field office were on their way to Elkhart, and the case was being treated as a suspected stranger abduction, the worst-case scenario that everyone was thinking but nobody wanted to say out loud. The search expanded as daylight faded into dusk, that golden hour when Hannah would normally be chasing fireflies in the backyard, and volunteers from across Elkhart County arrived to help. They formed lines and walked through the fields and woods surrounding the neighborhood, calling Hannah's name, looking for any sign of disturbed ground or discarded clothing or evidence of a struggle. Bloodhounds were brought in and given Hannah's scent from her bedroom, from the stuffed rabbit she slept with every night, and they tracked around the neighborhood but lost the trail on the street, suggesting she'd gotten into a vehicle. That detail, when Chief Brennan shared it with Ray and Barbara later that night, felt like a death sentence even though nobody said the word dead. If she got into a car, if someone took her in a car, she could be anywhere by now. Indiana is surrounded by other states, by highways and back roads and 1,000 places to disappear. The FBI agents who arrived that night brought procedure and experience, but also a grim realism that the local police had been trying to avoid. Special Agent Thomas Whitmore, a man who'd worked child abduction cases across the Midwest, sat down with Ray and Barbara in their kitchen while other agents processed Hannah's bedroom and interviewed neighbors, and he asked questions that felt cruel but necessary. Were there any custody disputes? Any relatives or friends who'd expressed inappropriate interest in Hannah? Any recent visitors or workers at the house? Had Hannah ever mentioned being approached by strangers or feeling uncomfortable around anyone? Ray and Barbara answered each question while their other children were sent to stay with Barbara's mother, and the house that had been full of noise and life that morning felt hollow and haunted. Every time a phone rang, Barbara jumped, hoping it was someone calling to say they'd found Hannah playing in someone's backyard or sleeping in a neighbor's shed, anything except what they were all starting to fear. The investigation moved quickly in those first crucial hours, the way all good investigations do when a child is missing and time is the enemy. FBI agents interviewed every adult within a mile radius of the Hughes home. They pulled records on recently released sex offenders in Indiana and neighboring states. They looked at drifters, transients, anyone who might have been passing through Elkhart that weekend. They set up roadblocks on major highways and distributed Hannah's description to police departments across the region. They searched the St. Joseph River and every body of water within 10 miles. They brought in volunteers with boats to drag the deeper sections. They searched abandoned buildings, empty houses, railroad cars sitting on sidings. They interviewed truck drivers and delivery men and postal workers, anyone who might have been in the neighborhood that day and seen something useful. And they focused intensely on the mysterious man in the dark sedan, the figure multiple witnesses had mentioned, but nobody could describe well enough to create a useful composite sketch. 3 days into the investigation, a potential break emerged. A gas station attendant in Napanee, about 15 miles southeast of Elkhart, reported that on Saturday afternoon around 30,000 p.m., a man matching the vague description from Maple Street had stopped for gas, and the attendant thought he'd seen something small and blonde in the back seat of the car. Maybe a child, maybe a doll, or a bundle of clothes. He wasn't sure. The man had paid cash, hadn't spoken much, and driven off heading east toward Ohio. FBI agents descended on Napanee, interviewed the attendant for hours, showed him photographs of vehicles and suspects, but the details remained frustratingly unclear. Maybe it was Hannah. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe the attendant was remembering wrong or conflating different customers or trying to be helpful in a way that wasn't actually helpful. They tracked east into Ohio anyway, following that thin thread of possibility, contacting police departments and showing Hannah's photo and hoping for another sighting, another clue, another piece of evidence that would lead them to a 6-year-old girl who'd vanished like smoke. By the end of the first week, the case was national news. Hannah's school photo, the one from kindergarten where she's grinning with her front teeth still intact and her hair in those neat pigtails, appeared in newspapers across the country. The FBI's most wanted bulletin included her description. Television news programs ran segments about the little girl who disappeared from her driveway in broad daylight. Tips poured in from everywhere, hundreds of them, each one requiring follow-up, each one a possible lead or a dead end. Someone saw a girl matching Hannah's description at a rest stop in Missouri. Someone else reported a man acting suspiciously with a young blonde child at a diner in Michigan. A psychic from California called claiming Hannah was alive and being held in a farmhouse near a body of water. Every tip was investigated, every lead followed, and every single one went nowhere. The man in the dark sedan was never identified, never found, never confirmed to have actually existed beyond the vague recollections of witnesses who might have been seeing different men on different days or might have been manufacturing memories to feel like they were helping. The investigation also turned uncomfortably inward, the way these cases always do when outside leads dry up. FBI agents looked hard at Ray and Barbara, at their marriage, at their finances, at any possible motive for harming their own child or staging a disappearance. They interviewed Hannah's teachers from kindergarten, her Sunday school instructor at First Baptist Church, neighbors who might have seen family dynamics from the outside. They found nothing suspicious. Ray worked long hours but was by all accounts a devoted father. Barbara was overwhelmed with 4 young children but loved them fiercely. There were no signs of abuse, no concerning behavior, no red flags that suggested anything other than a working-class family living a normal life in a small Indiana town. The investigation also looked at relatives, friends, acquaintances, anyone who'd been to the Hughes home in recent months. Barbara's sister Joan and her husband had visited from Kentucky in July, stayed for a long weekend, but they'd been back in Louisville for weeks by the time Hannah disappeared. Ray's brother lived in South Bend and had an alibi for Saturday afternoon. Extended family members were interviewed, alibis confirmed, suspicions raised and dismissed as the investigation cast its net wider and wider while catching nothing substantial. By September, when Hannah should have been starting first grade, the intensive search had wound down and the case had settled into the grim reality of an unsolved child abduction. Volunteers stopped showing up to search fields that had already been searched a dozen times. FBI agents returned to Indianapolis, leaving local police to continue following leads that had become increasingly desperate and unlikely. The Elkhart Police Department established a dedicated tip line, and Chief Brennan assigned Detective Carl Morrison, a 26-year-old rookie who'd only been with the department for 2 years, to work the case full-time. Morrison threw himself into it with the intensity of someone who couldn't accept failure, someone who saw Hannah smile in that school photo and couldn't imagine a world where she wasn't found. He interviewed and re-interviewed witnesses. He drove to Napanee and talked to the gas station attendant 3 more times. He spent hours in the woods and fields around Elkhart, walking search grids alone, looking for something everyone else had missed. He went to the Hughes home every week to update Ray and Barbara, watching them age in real time, watching hope fade from their eyes even as they insisted they believed Hannah was still alive, still out there, still coming home someday. The family held a memorial service in December 1961, not quite a funeral because there was no body and Barbara refused to use the word dead, but something to mark the fact that Hannah wouldn't be home for Christmas, that their daughter had been gone for 4 months and the police had no answers. The church was packed, the whole town turning out to support a family that had become a symbol of every parent's worst nightmare. Ray stood at the front and spoke about Hannah in the present tense, talked about her love of fireflies and her gap-toothed smile, and how she made everyone around her happier just by being herself. Barbara couldn't speak, just sat in the front pew with her remaining children pressed against her, while the congregation sang hymns and prayed for Hannah's safe return, and tried to find meaning in something that had none. After the service, people filed past the Hughes family offering condolences that felt premature and hollow. Because condolences are for the dead and nobody knew if Hannah was dead, nobody knew anything at all. The case went cold, not with a bang, but with a slow, agonizing fade, the way most cold cases do. 1962 arrived, and Hannah was still gone. 1963.964. The investigation remained officially open, but with no new leads and no evidence, there was nothing left to investigate. Detective Morrison kept the file on his desk, kept Hannah's photo pinned to his bulletin board, but even he had to admit they'd hit a wall. The man in the dark sedan, if he'd even existed, had vanished as completely as Hannah. There were no witnesses to an actual abduction, no physical evidence, no ransom demand, no body, nothing to work with except the terrible fact that a little girl had been outside playing one moment and gone the next. Ray and Barbara refused to move from the house on Maple Street, convinced that if Hannah escaped or was released or somehow found her way home, she'd come back to the only address she'd ever known. Barbara left the porch light on every night, a beacon in the darkness, and Hannah's bedroom remained exactly as she'd left it, her toys and books and the collection of smooth stones on the windowsill waiting for her return. The red bicycle was eventually put in the garage, too painful to look at, but Ray couldn't bring himself to get rid of it, just in case Hannah came home and wanted to ride it again, wanted everything to go back to the way it was on that August afternoon before the screen door started banging and their lives fell apart. The town of Elkhart moved on because time moves on whether you want it to or not, but Maple Street carried the weight of what had happened there, and for years afterward, mothers would call their children inside a little earlier, hold them a little tighter, and think about Barbara Hughes and the day. Gerda, who disappeared into thin air on a day so ordinary it should have been forgotten by evening. The years after Hannah's disappearance didn't pass so much as accumulate, like sediment settling at the bottom of a river, layer upon layer of grief and unanswered questions that hardened into something permanent and immovable. Barbara Hughes aged a decade in the first year alone, her hair going gray at the temples, lines appearing around her eyes and mouth that hadn't been there before August 1961. She developed rituals that the family learned not to question. Every morning she'd stand at Hannah's bedroom door for exactly 60 seconds, just looking at the unchanged space, the stuffed rabbit still on the pillow, the Sunday school papers still tacked to the wall, the stones still arranged by color on the windowsill. Every night she checked the porch light to make sure it was on, that beacon burning through the darkness in case Hannah was out there somewhere, lost and trying to find her way home. Ray tried to get her to see a doctor, tried to talk to her about moving forward, but Barbara would look at him with eyes that had gone hollow and say the same thing every time. We can't move forward when part of us is still missing. We have to wait. She has to know where to find us. The other Hughes children grew up in the shadow of their sister's disappearance, their childhoods marked by what wasn't there rather than what was. Tommy, who'd been sitting on the front step playing with his toy truck that afternoon, developed a stutter that lasted for years and a guilt complex that lasted much longer. He'd been right there, just a few feet away, and he hadn't seen anything, hadn't heard anything, couldn't help the police with any useful information. His parents told him over and over that it wasn't his fault. He was only 4 years old. There was nothing he could have done. But children don't process trauma rationally, and Tommy carried the weight of his sister's disappearance like it was something he should have prevented. The older children, Rachel and David, became parentified too young, taking care of their younger siblings while their mother drifted through the house like a ghost, and their father worked overtime at the factory to avoid the silence that filled every room. They learned not to mention Hannah at dinner, not to ask questions about what might have happened, not to bring friends over because the house felt wrong, frozen in 1961 while the rest of the world kept moving. Detective Carl Morrison couldn't let it go either. even as the department assigned him other cases, other investigations that actually had leads to follow and evidence to process. Hannah's file lived on his desk for 3 years until his lieutenant finally made him move it to the storage room, told him he had to accept that some cases don't get solved, that sometimes the answers just aren't there. But Morrison took the file home instead, kept it in his spare bedroom alongside copies of all the witness statements and evidence logs and the timeline he'd constructed and reconstructed 100 times, trying to find something everyone had missed. He worked the case on his own time, spending weekends driving to neighboring states following tips that were years old, interviewing witnesses again, even though their memories had faded and changed with time. His wife divorced him in 1968, told him he was more married to a ghost than to her, that she couldn't compete with a case that would never be solved. And Morrison couldn't even argue because she was right. Hannah Hughes had become an obsession, a puzzle that refused to be solved. And Morrison couldn't accept the possibility that he'd never know what happened to that little girl with the gap-toothed smile. The 1970s brought changes to Elkhart that made Hannah's disappearance feel even more distant, like something from another era entirely. The RV industry boomed and then crashed, factories closing and reopening and closing again, and Ray Hughes found himself laid off twice before finally taking a job with lower pay and no benefits, just to keep food on the table. Maple Street started to look shabby, houses that had been well maintained in the 60s showing their age, younger families moving to the newer subdivisions on the east side of town where the lawns were green and the streets were safe and there were no ghosts hanging over the neighborhood. But the Hughes family stayed, Barbara still refusing to move, still keeping that porch light burning every night, still maintaining Hannah's bedroom like a shrine. The local newspaper ran an anniversary story every August 19th for the first 10 years, then every 5 years after that, then stopped running them at all because new tragedies had replaced the old one, and people's capacity for sustained grief has natural limits even when the family's at the center of those tragedies have no such luxury. In 1976, a woman called the Elkhart Police Department claiming she'd seen Hannah Hughes. She was certain, absolutely certain, that the teenage girl working at a diner in Fort Wayne was Hannah, had the same blonde hair and facial structure, would be about the right age. Morrison, now a sergeant with 15 years on the force, drove to Fort Wayne with his heart pounding, with Barbara's desperate hope ringing in his ears because he'd called to tell her before he left, breaking protocol but unable to help himself. The girl at the diner was polite and confused, showed Morrison her birth certificate and school records, brought her parents in from the kitchen where her father cooked and her mother managed the register. She wasn't Hannah. She'd lived in Fort Wayne her entire life. She just happened to have blonde hair and a passing resemblance to what a 6-year-old might look like at 16. Morrison drove back to Elkhart and had to tell Barbara it wasn't her. Watched hope die in her eyes one more time, added another disappointment to a list that had grown long and cruel over the years. The false sightings became a pattern, a torture of their own. Someone would call, certain they'd seen Hannah at a mall in Indianapolis, or a grocery store in Chicago, or walking down a street in Cleveland. Sometimes the tips came with photographs, blurry Polaroids of blonde women who bore vague resemblances to what Hannah might look like at 20 or 25 or 30. Barbara kept every photo, stored them in a shoebox in her closet alongside Hannah's baby pictures and school projects, and the missing person flyers that had been distributed across the Midwest in 1961. She'd compare the photos, looking for Hannah in the features of strangers, convincing herself sometimes that yes, this one had Hannah's eyes, or that one had Hannah's smile, only to have Morrison or the FBI or local police, wherever the sighting occurred, confirm that it wasn't her, it was never her. Anna remained lost in whatever darkness had swallowed her that August afternoon. Barbara Hughes died in November 1989, 28 years after Hannah's disappearance, and her death certificate listed heart failure as the cause. But everyone who knew her understood it was grief that killed her, grief that had worn her down cell by cell and year by year until there was nothing left. She was 64 years old but looked 80, her body used up by decades of waiting and hoping and standing in doorways looking at empty rooms. At her funeral, the pastor talked about faith in heaven and reunions beyond this life, and Ray sat in the front pew with his surviving children and thought about how Barbara had lived those 28 years in a kind of purgatory, unable to move forward and unable to go back, trapped in the moment. When she'd heard that screen door banging and realized something terrible had happened. They buried her at Riverview Cemetery on a cold, gray day that threatened snow, and Ray stood at the grave afterward thinking about the plot they'd purchased beside Barbara's, the one that had always been intended for him, but now felt like it might need to be for Hannah if she was ever found, if there was ever a body to bury, if they ever got answers. The 1990s brought new technology to law enforcement, DNA databases and computer systems and forensic techniques that didn't exist in 1961, and Morrison, now a lieutenant heading up the detective division, wondered if these advances might finally crack Hannah's case. But DNA analysis requires biological evidence, samples to test and compare, and Hannah's case had none of that. No body had ever been found. No crime scene had been established. The investigation had been thorough, but the evidence collected was minimal because there was no evidence to collect. Just a bicycle left lying in a driveway and witness statements about a man who might or might not have existed. Morrison submitted Hannah's case information to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children when it was established, included her in new databases tracking unsolved child abductions, but without something concrete to work with, the case remained as cold as it had been in 1962. Ray Hughes followed Barbara in death in 2003, a massive stroke that killed him while he was watching television on a Tuesday night, alone in the house on Maple Street that had become a monument to loss. He was 78 years old and had spent 42 years wondering what happened to his daughter, carrying that question through every day of his life without ever getting an answer. His surviving children, now middle-aged themselves with children and grandchildren of their own, gathered to clean out the house and finally let it go. Tommy, the little boy who'd been sitting on the front step that day, was 52 now and still couldn't talk about Hannah without his voice breaking. Rachel was 57, David 55, and they walked through the house on Maple Street, seeing it with adult eyes and recognizing the pathology their parents had built, the shrine-like quality of Hannah's preserved bedroom, the boxes of newspaper clippings and false leads and psychic visions Barbara had collected over decades. They found letters Barbara had written to Hannah but never sent, dozens of them, updating her on family news and telling her about her nieces and nephews and begging her to come home. The letters were dated across years, some from the 1970s, some from the 1980s, the last one written just weeks before Barbara's death, and reading them was like watching someone slowly lose their mind to grief while remaining functional enough that nobody outside the family understood the depth of damage. The Hughes siblings kept some things and donated others and threw away decades of accumulated sorrow, but they couldn't bring themselves to close Hannah's case file completely. Rachel took over the role their mother had played, calling Morrison every few months for updates, even though there were never any updates, marking August 19th every year with a quiet acknowledgement of what had been lost. David became an amateur investigator himself, spending hours online as the internet made information more accessible, reading about cold cases that had been solved decades later through new technology or deathbed confessions or random chances. He posted about Hannah on message boards devoted to missing persons, uploaded her photo to websites tracking unsolved disappearances, connected with other families who'd lost children to similar mysteries. The internet gave him something his parents never had, a community of people who understood what it meant to live with permanent uncertainty, to exist in a state of frozen grief, because without a body and without answers, you can't properly mourn and you can't properly move on. Tommy went a different direction, tried to leave it behind, moved to Arizona, and built a life as far from Elkhart and Maple Street in that August afternoon as he could get. But the guilt followed him anyway, manifested in nightmares where he was 4 years old again, sitting on the front step, and this time he looked up. This time he saw the man taking Hannah. This time he screamed and ran and stopped it from happening. He'd wake up sweating and shaking, his wife asking what was wrong, and he could never quite explain that he was still that little boy with the toy truck, still sitting there useless while his sister disappeared, still carrying the irrational belief that if he just paid attention, if he just looked up at the right moment, everything would have been different. Detective Morrison retired from the Elkhart Police Department in 2008 after 42 years of service, and at his retirement party his colleagues gave him a plaque and made speeches about his dedication and his solve rate. But Morrison stood there thinking about the one case that got away, the one that had defined his career more than all his successes combined. He took the Hannah Hughes file home officially this time, all the boxes of evidence and statements and dead-end leads, and set up a workspace in what had been his daughter's bedroom before she'd grown up and moved away. He spent his retirement the way he'd spent most of his career, obsessing over details and timelines and the mystery of how a 6-year-old girl could vanish so completely. His children worried about him, told him he needed to let it go, to enjoy his retirement instead of chasing a ghost. But Morrison couldn't explain to them what it was like to look into the eyes of parents who'd lost everything and promise them you'd find answers and then spend 4 decades failing T. Oh, keep that promise. By 2014, Morrison was 78 years old and dying. The cancer had started in his lungs, moved to his liver and bones, and the doctors gave him months at best. He was on hospice at home, his children taking turns staying with him, making him comfortable, waiting for the end. And Morrison, who'd faced death before in his career but never his own, found himself thinking about Hannah Hughes more than ever, wondering if he'd die without ever knowing what happened to her, if his last conscious thoughts would be about that unsolved case and those unanswered questions. In a moment of clarity between morphine doses, he asked his daughter to contact the local news to see if they'd run one more story about Hannah, one final plea for information before he died. His daughter thought it was the cancer talking, the drugs making him fixate on old cases, but she called anyway because dying men's requests carry weight even when they seem pointless. The local NBC affiliate sent a reporter and cameraman to Morrison's house in October 2014, and they filmed him in his living room, thin and gray and obviously dying, talking about a case from 1961 that nobody under 50 remembered. Morrison held up Hannah's kindergarten photo, the one that had been reproduced thousands of times over the years, and he spoke directly to the camera with a voice that was weak but steady. If anyone knows anything about what happened to Hannah Hughes, if anyone saw something that day or heard something over the years, or has information they've kept to themselves for whatever reason, please come forward. I'm dying, and I'll never get to solve this case. But the family deserves answers. Hannah deserves to be found. The segment ran on the 10 o'clock news on a Tuesday night, and the station posted it to their website and social media. And Morrison watched it with his daughter beside him and thought that at least he'd tried. One last time he'd tried, even if nothing came of it, like nothing had come of anything else in 53 years. But someone was watching. Someone Morrison had never met, someone living 5 hours south in rural Kentucky, someone who'd stumbled across the news segment online while browsing Facebook on a Wednesday morning, someone whose hand started shaking as she watched the old detective hold up that kindergarten photo, someone whose fragmented childhood memories, the ones she'd spent decades trying to ignore because they didn't match the stories she'd been told about who she was, suddenly started clicking into place like puzzle pieces finding their edges. Someone named Sarah Miller, who was about to realize she might not be Sarah Miller at all. Sarah Miller was 60 years old, living in a small town called Hickory Grove, about 20 miles outside Bowling Green, Kentucky, and she'd spent most of her adult life trying not to think too hard about the gaps in her childhood memories, the inconsistencies in her origin story that never quite add up, but were easier to ignore than to interrogate. She worked as a librarian at the county library, had been married for 35 years to a good man named Tom, who ran a hardware store, had 3 grown children and 5 grandchildren, and lived what most people would consider a quiet, unremarkable life. But there had always been something underneath that quiet surface, a dissonance she couldn't name, dreams that felt more like memories of a different house, a different family, a different name that her mind couldn't quite reach. Her parents, James and Carol Miller, had raised her with love and care, homeschooled her through 8th grade before finally letting her attend the local high school, moved every few years when she was young for reasons they never fully explained, kept her somewhat isolated from extended family and outside relationships in ways that seemed normal when you were living it, but strange when you look back as an adult. The problem was her birth certificate, or rather, the lack of one that made sense. When Sarah had applied for a passport in her 30s, planning her first trip abroad with Tom, she'd needed a birth certificate and discovered that the one her parents had given her was wrong somehow. The dates didn't align with records, and she'd had to get a delayed certificate based on her parents' affidavits and some elementary school records. Her parents had explained it away, said there'd been a fire at the courthouse where she was born, said record-keeping was sloppy in the 50s, said it didn't matter because they knew when she was born and that was enough. Sarah had accepted the explanation because what else could she do? But it had planted a seed of doubt that grew quietly over the years, especially after both her parents died in a car accident in 2010, taking with them any possibility of getting real answers about the inconsistencies in her early Faye. So when Sarah saw Detective Morrison's face on a computer screen that Wednesday morning in October 2014, when she heard him talk about Hannah Hughes and saw that kindergarten photo, something deep in her mind shifted and cracked open. She knew that name. Not consciously, not in a way she could articulate, but somewhere in the buried parts of her childhood memory, Hannah Hughes meant something. She stared at the photo of the little girl with blonde pigtails and a gap-toothed smile, and fragments started surfacing that she'd spent 60 years suppressing. A red bicycle, a screen door that banged, a street called Maple, a voice calling a name that wasn't Sarah. That was something else, something she'd been told to forget. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely control the mouse, and she watched the news segment 3 more times, each viewing bringing more fragments, more impossible memories that couldn't be real, but felt more real than anything in her constructed history. Sarah didn't tell Tom at first, spent 3 days researching Hannah Hughes online, finding old newspaper articles about the disappearance, reading about the investigation and the false leads and the family that had spent decades waiting for answers. She found photos of Barbara and Ray Hughes, and something about Barbara's face made Sarah's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name, like grief for someone she'd never met but somehow knew. She looked at her own baby photos, the ones that started when she was around 7 years old, with no explanation for why there were no earlier pictures. And she looked at Hannah's kindergarten photo, and she saw similarities in the facial structure, the shape of the eyes, the way their smiles curved. It seemed impossible. Her parents had loved her, had raised her, had been good people who'd never given her reason to doubt them. But they'd also moved constantly when she was young, had isolated her, had been oddly paranoid about government records and official documentation, had no extended family they ever visited, and no friends from before Sarah was born. On the 4th day, Sarah called the Elkhart Police Department with a story that sounded insane even as she told it. She spoke to a detective named Jennifer Walsh who listened with professional skepticism as Sarah explained that she'd seen the news segment about Hannah Hughes, that she had reason to believe she might be Hannah, that her childhood memories didn't align with what she'd been told about her life. Walsh took down Sarah's information and said someone would be in touch, and Sarah hung up feeling foolish and crazy and certain she'd just made a terrible mistake. But Walsh had been around long enough to know that sometimes the impossible turns out to be true, and she pulled the Hannah Hughes file from archives and called Detective Morrison, who was in hospice care but still lucid enough to take the call, and she told him about the woman from Kentucky who, though she might be the missing girl he'd spent his career trying to find. The DNA test took 2 weeks that felt like 2 years. Sarah drove to Indianapolis to meet with FBI agents and give a sample, sitting in a sterile office while they swabbed the inside of her cheek and explained the process and managed her expectations because this was almost certainly a dead end, another false hope in a case full of them. They needed to compare her DNA to samples from Hannah's biological family, and Rachel Hughes, now 70 years old, agreed to provide a reference sample even though she'd been through this before with other women who'd claimed to be Hannah, and she couldn't let herself believe this time would be different. The waiting was excruciating. Sarah went through her days at the library trying to act normal, while her entire understanding of her identity hung in balance. Tom held her at night while she cried, not knowing if she was crying for the little girl who might have been stolen, or for the parents who might have been kidnappers, or for the life she thought she lived that might have been built on lies. The call came on November 18, 2014. Special Agent Whitmore, the same agent who'd worked the original case in 1961 before retiring and being brought back as a consultant, delivered the news that seemed to defy reality. The DNA was a match. Sarah Miller was Hannah Hughes. The woman who'd lived 60 years as one person was genetically, definitively, someone else entirely. The impossible had happened. The cold case that had defined Detective Morrison's career and destroyed the Hughes family had just been solved by a Facebook video and a woman brave enough to question her own history. What emerged in the investigation that followed was a truth more painful than kidnapping by a stranger. James and Carol Miller, the people Sarah had known as Mom and Dad, were actually James and Carol Henderson, Barbara Hughes' sister and brother-in-law. They'd visited Elkhart in July 1961, had met Hannah, had fallen in love with the bright little girl because they couldn't have children of their own. They'd asked Ray and Barbara about adoption and been refused, told that Hannah was happy and loved and not available. So they'd come back in August to a family barbecue on August 19th that nobody had thought to mention to police because family isn't suspicious. And while everyone was distracted with food and conversation, Carol had told Hannah they were going to get ice cream, had walked her to their car parked due, won the street, had driven away with her niece while Ray was manning the grill, and Barbara was in the kitchen and nobody noticed until it was too late, until the Hendersons were already across the state line with a confused 6-year-old who kept asking when they were going home. They'd told Hannah her parents had died, that they'd rescued her, that her name was Sarah now, and she had to forget about being Hannah because that life was gone. They'd moved to Kentucky, changed their last name to Miller, homeschooled her to avoid questions, moved frequently to stay ahead of any investigation, and raised her with genuine love even as they'd built her entire identity on a theft and a lie. They'd watched the news coverage, had known about the search and Barbara's grief and the years of false hope, and they'd kept their secret until the car accident in 2010 killed them both and took the truth to their graves. Or so they'd thought. Detective Carl Morrison died on December 3, 2014, 15 days after learning that Hannah Hughes had been found alive. His daughter said he spent those final days at peace for the first time in decades, finally able to let go of the case that had haunted him, finally able to die knowing the answer, even if he'd never fully understand how two people could love a child, enough to raise her well and betray her profoundly. At the same time, Rachel and David and Tommy Hughes met their sister at a hotel in Indianapolis in early December, sitting across from a 60-year-old stranger who had their sister's DNA and their mother's eyes, but no memory of being part of their family. The reunion was awkward and painful and complicated in ways that television movies about found children never capture, because Sarah mourned the parents she'd lost even knowing what they'd done, and the Hughes siblings struggled to see their 6-year-old sister and this grandmother who'd lived an entire life they'd missed. Sarah returned to Elkhart for the first time in 53 years, just before Christmas 2014, driving down Maple Street with Rachel beside her, and nothing looked familiar until suddenly everything did, fragments coalescing into memories she'd buried so deep she'd convinced herself they were dreams. The house had been sold and resold, looked different now, but she stood in the driveway where her red bicycle had fallen and she remembered, really remembered, pedaling in circles while Tommy played on the steps, and her mother called from inside, and Aunt Carol said, "Let's go get ice cream." She remembered the moment her life had split in two, 6-year-old Hannah ending and 7-year-old Sarah beginning, and she understood finally why she'd always felt like she was living someone else's story. The town held a welcome home ceremony that felt both joyful and unbearably sad, because Hannah Hughes had been found. But Sarah Miller's entire life had been based on a lie, and there was no way to celebrate one reality without mourning the other. Rachel gave her the red bicycle that their father had kept in his garage for 53 years, and Sarah stood holding it with tears streaming down her face, this artifact of a childhood that had been stolen from her by people she'd loved and trusted. She was Hannah and she was Sarah, both and neither, a woman caught between two identities and two families and two versions of truth that couldn't be reconciled. She'd been found alive after 54 years, which was a miracle, but the finding had cost her everything she thought she knew about who she was, which was its own kind of loss. The case was solved, the mystery answered. But the resolution brought more questions than comfort, and Sarah spent her remaining years trying to integrate two lives into one coherent story, trying to forgive the unforgivable, trying to understand how love and betrayal could be so completely intertwined, that you couldn't separate one from the other.